Romans chapter 15, verses 23 through 32. But now there is no more place for me to work in these regions. And since I have been longing for many years to see you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to visit you while passing through and to have you visit me on my journey there, after I have enjoyed your company for a while. Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the saints there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution to the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. So after I have completed this task and have made sure that they have received this fruit, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way. I know that when I come to you, I will come in full measure of the blessing of Christ. I urge you, brothers, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to join me in my struggle by praying to God for me. Pray that I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, and that my service in Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints there, so that by God's will I may come to you with joy and together with you be refreshed.
I don't know if you found the words that we just read from Romans 15 familiar or not. I know that our tendency is, as we're reading through some of Paul's letters, is that, and especially with a book like Romans, that there are so many really rich ideas. There's so much to challenge us to think about, that often in Paul's letters, when we get near the end of the letter, we say, oh, he's starting into some personal comments now, and then we just kind of skim over it or just kind of skip on and not pay much attention to it. A number of years ago, took a class on what's called expository preaching, which is what I like to do now. And what that means is you take a passage of Scripture and you read it and you study that one passage and you base the lesson just right out of that text. Sometimes sermons jump all over the place and take passages, unfortunately, out of context, or people who have difficulty following and moving from place to place. And the person who was teaching this class, who was a Bible professor at one of the Christian universities, said, the advantage of doing expository preaching is that by sticking in the text and taking these passages, you maybe look at things that you might not have looked at before. And as I've been thinking about this section of Romans, I thought, there's some great material and some great ideas here. And in a way, I'd like to think of this and kind of help you think of this as the personal side of Paul. We think of Paul as the great apostle, Paul as the great evangelist, Paul as the one who shares some Romans is a very challenging book in terms of the material, the ideas that it contains. But as you come to this section of Romans, and get down here to chapter 15 and into chapter 16, that there's some personal things that Paul has to say here that help give a little bit of an insight into him. And I think there's a point that we'll get to from that, in case you're wondering. All right, in the verses right before what Ray read to us, Paul talks a little bit about, you might call it his philosophy of ministry. And one part of that is that he has preached to the Gentiles. He preached to the Jewish people as he traveled, but he considered himself the apostle to the Gentiles, that is, people who were not Jewish, and that he had preached from Jerusalem to Illyricum. Now, Illyricum is on the western side of what we call Greece. We don't even have a record in the book of Acts of him visiting there. We don't know anything about. But he says that that was kind of, at the time that he wrote this, that was about as far west as he had traveled. That his ambition has been to preach Christ where he was not known. You know, Paul, in writing the church at Corinth, talked about the idea, you know, he said, I planted, and then Apollos, who was another early Christian evangelist, quite an intellectually gifted man, that Apollos had, you know, followed Paul there to Corinth. So Paul used the idea, he said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. And so Paul here in Romans is acknowledging that what he really likes to do is to go somewhere where the gospel has never been. He likes to, we kind of think about it, break new ground. I mean, that's really the ultimate missionary, isn't it? To go to a place that has never heard the gospel and to tell Jesus. And part of it is so that he would not be building on someone else's foundation. You know, I think about that passage in 1 Corinthians, I think, okay, in other words, he doesn't want to be building on somebody else's work, but he's going to leave that for other people. You know, some people have the gift of planting new churches. Some people do a great job of building from what has been started. And some help them grow from that point. You know, you can just think about different stages that a congregation might go through. So, now he's thinking about what his future would be. Well, he's thinking in terms of, okay, now I want to go to Rome. And then from Rome, I want to go on to Spain. So you can just see that goal of going to new places with the gospel. You know, and a lot of people, you know, we're familiar with the history of Paul's travels in the book of Acts, but we never read of him, you know, in that sense going to Rome, as we kind of, okay. So he admits in this section, though, that there's a challenge that he faces. First, he needs to go to Jerusalem. And he explains why. He says that he's carrying gifts from Macedonia and Achaia. You know, this is one of those things that kind of allow us to connect 1st and 2nd Corinthians along with Acts and Romans to kind of coordinate those books to the history of Paul, because he's going with the gifts that he wrote to the church at Corinth about from Macedonia and Achaia to the poor saints in Jerusalem. There has been a famine. There are people who are starving. They're struggling. They're Christians. And so Paul, recognizing this need, has been collecting money from Macedonia and Achaia, from churches there, to take it down, to help with that relief. And he refers to this as a service. And that's an interesting word, because that is the same Greek word that we get deacon from. So, you know, when the New Testament uses words like service, ministry, deacon, they're all coming from the same Greek word. You know, and this is an important thing that he's doing. It's hands-on ministry for them. And he says, as you may have noticed in the reading, that the Christians in Macedonia and Achaia consider this a privilege to be able to send help to the Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem and Judea who are suffering. And further, Paul says, even if they don't see it as a privilege, they have a debt, because the Jewish Christians have shared their spiritual blessing, that is Jesus Christ, with the Gentiles. Those people, they had sent him out to persecute Christians. For Paul to go back there, you know, and you can imagine for the Jewish leaders who knew Paul, we don't want to do. Well, Paul is kind of manning up here and say, I need to take this gift to the people who need it. And Paul's attitude is really that what happens to me doesn't, as he's writing here to the church at Rome, that we are working together on the same team. Also, he mentions the idea of them assisting on his journey. Now, we know that people who are traveling, missionaries who are going to other parts of the world, need support financially as well as spiritually, as the first point suggests. They need the opportunity to share the need and have local churches help them as they go. Roman Christians, I would like you to help me as I go on my journey to Spain. I'd like you to pray for me. The idea of going. Because he knows there are people there who hate him, who want violence. He used to be one who led the violence. He used to be one who arrested the Christians. He held the garments of the people who stoned Stephen. And in a sense, you could almost think about the picture of Paul going back to face the music. I use that expression, that the offering that I'm taking, the service that I'm bringing to the needy Christians there in Judea, is acceptable to the saints. Sacrifice of the people who gave. Letters to the Corinthians, that there were Christians who begged for the opportunity to give to this, and who gave even beyond their ability to give. You understand what that means? That they actually did without things because they wanted to help these Christians that they did not know in other parts of the world. That's powerful. And so praying that the gift will be received with the same generous spirit that it was given. Also to pray that he will be able to visit Rome and ultimately Spain. We joke sometimes about the idea that, you say, be careful what you ask for. You may get it. Paul is praying for and asking them to pray for him to be able to visit Rome. But if you remember the story from the book of Acts, that after Jerusalem, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem and is taken to Rome to appear on trial before the emperor in chains. I don't know that he would necessarily have seen that as the answer that he was wanting, but yet it's not an answer that Paul feared, was it? Because Paul, even in chains, would address those who sat in judgment of him and tell them the good news about Jesus. He saw it as an opportunity. And I think maybe strengthened by the thought that Christians around the world were praying for him to have the ability to go to Rome. And then to pray that we will be mutually encouraged and strengthened. That's really what our work as brothers and sisters, as Christians, as a congregation, and as a global fellowship should be about. That we are encouraging and strengthening one another. That our involvement with one another, it's not just that we're a bunch of strangers who come together, go through this little time together, and then we go off and ignore each other. We are involved in one another's lives. We are sharing a ministry together. And we are all, in one way or another, part of that ministry. That's the beauty of the gospel and of the church. So, what do we do? Okay, number one, we take that role of fellowship and encouragement for those who go. We know that not every Christian is going to be able to go to another part of the world to carry the gospel. But we know there are some who will have a passion for doing that. Whether they come from our own congregation or from other congregations, our role is to encourage and support those people. To give them the encouragement, to recognize that spending your life in another part of the world, in a culture that's different from what you're familiar with, has a price. You leave family and friends. You leave social ties. You leave the comfort. And there are some people who go to live in places of danger because they are persuaded they need to take the gospel. They need to preach Jesus. They need to encourage and strengthen the church in other places. And so they need financial support. Back in chapter 10, Paul has made a couple of statements, that we're mainly familiar with. Romans 10:17. It talks about faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the preaching of Christ. But just right before that, Paul has been talking about, that process of preaching. And he makes the statement, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach. Well, for the very reasons I just mentioned. They are the ones who go. But how can they go, he says, unless they are sent? They need the support and the encouragement, especially financially. One of the challenges of missionaries overseas is the fact that they're dependent on the people back home for support, financially, as well as prayer and spiritually. But one of the issues that missionaries talk to me about is the fact that churches make promises to send them so much money in their own currency, not in the currency of the country where they are. And so what happens to the missionary when the currency drops? Or when the supporting currency from the supporting country drops? So that what used to be worth 100 of whatever suddenly is only worth 50. The need to recognize the sacrifice these people are making and their need for encouragement is just critical. So how can they go unless they are sent? But then the role of prayer for these people. One of the things that happens is that many missionaries overseas are just begging for Christians in North America to pray for them. Isn't that interesting? You'd think the financial thing would be maybe a bigger issue, but they're praying for the prayer support. It's one of those things that we can do that doesn't cost us anything. Maybe I can't go. Maybe I don't have the means to give, but I can pray. And I can write. I can send an email to let them know. They're in my prayers. See, for Paul on this visit, as he is talking about his desire to go and be with the church in Rome, it's out of that heart that he has to share Christ with the rest of the world, to go places where the gospel has never gone, to tell people about Jesus. Well, to do that, he needs other Christians to be part of that ministry. And I think sometimes what we really need to do is to really realize that we are part of the ministry of preaching Christ around the world. And that we do that not only in our giving, but also in our prayer. I want to encourage everybody here, take time every day to pray for our missionaries who are sent out by this congregation, who are supported by our budget, but also others that you read about. I saw an article this past week that was sent to me for the Gospel Herald about what's going on among congregations in Europe as the Syrian refugees are coming in. And you can imagine that what a challenge that is for those congregations as their nations, as we're about to see here in Canada and in Manitoba and Winnipeg. That there is opportunity to help people. And there's need for God's people to step up and to help. Let's stand as we sing our closing song.